What's going on, guys? It's Nerd Life. Welcome back to episode 2 of How to Program with Python for Beginners. In episode 1, we wrote an algorithm for a simple program that took 2 user inputs, added those together, and output them for the user to see. In today's episode, we will actually be coding that algorithm. So you guys will be coding in Python. You'll be setting up Python on your computer, and you will be writing your first lines of code. I know, it's very exciting. I hope you guys are excited for it. So in today's video, we're going to be covering 4 main topics, and before we start coding, I want to go over those with you guys, give you definitions for all of those topics, kind of just try to clarify them before we actually see them in code. So today we're going to be looking at input and output. So those are 2 topics: variables and data types, and casting. So those 4 things we will be looking at before we start coding, and these are 4 major topics that you're going to use throughout your time coding. Like, these are things you're going to be using in every single program ever, so it's good to learn them early, and I'm going to try to clarify them as much as I can for you guys to make it as simple as possible and get you guys going in the right direction. So let's hop over to the whiteboard and we will check those out. Alright guys, so originally I was going to do this portion on the whiteboard, but I figured just doing it in Notepad would be easier for you guys to see and just easier for me to film, so we're gonna do it in Notepad. Like I said at the beginning of this video, we want to cover input, output, variables and their data types, as well as casting. So those are 4 concepts that I want to cover in this video because we're gonna need them to write our code at the end of it. Let's just start out with data types. And this has to do with the variables you're using in your code. So variables can have a data type. They all have a data type. Now, there's 3 major data types that we're worried about in Python, and that is integers, which we call ints, floating point numbers or decimal numbers that we call floats, and strings, which are strings of characters. So let's see, I'll give you some examples of each one. So integers are numbers like 5, 10, 23, it doesn't really matter, but just whole numbers. Floating point numbers, on the other hand, can be stuff like 5.25, 10.001, or 10.001. You know, it doesn't really matter. It could even be something like 0.45. So floats are decimal numbers, and they can be decimal numbers. They can also be whole numbers, such as 5, but they have the ability to have those decimals with it. Strings are the kind of odd one in the bunch. They're not numbers. What they are strings of characters, like I said, so they can be like cat, hello. But here's something weird with strings, is they can also be numbers. So 100 is a string. Now, it's not seen as an actual number by Python, it's seen as a string of characters, so pretty much it's seen as a word, I guess you could say. Where do these come into play? Where do these data types come into play? So in episode 1, if you remember, we created a variable called number1, and we set it equal to 5 at one point. I want you guys to pause the video and guess what the data type of this number1 variable is now. If you guessed an integer, you are right. So number1 is now an integer. And in some programming languages, not Python, but in some, we have to actually explicitly declare that this variable is an int. So we have to say int number1 equals 5. Now in Python, we don't have to explicitly declare that. We can just say number1 equals 5. Now this equal sign I didn't really talk about in episode 1, and it's very important that I discuss it with you guys. It's called the assignment operator, and what it does is it places this value of 5 inside this identifier, and it's actually stored in RAM. So this value is actually stored in RAM, and when you use this number1 identifier later on in your program, your computer goes to that number1, sees that it has been assigned a data value, and then goes and finds where number1 is located in RAM, what location it's located in, and pulls that value out of RAM. So that's what this assignment operator, that equal sign, is doing. It's actually putting this value inside this identifier, this variable, and putting that in your memory, in your computer. So it's pretty cool. Different data types. So this number1 can be 5, so it's an integer. It could be 5.5, so it's a float. And it could be 5, and it's a string now. So a variable can have any data type. It just depends on how you declare it. If you write quotes around the number, it's going to be a string. If you leave the quotes out, it's going to be an integer. And again, we can have floats, we can have ints, we can have strings. This could be equal to 5.5. It could be equal to 5 in quotes like I had before. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so moving on from there, that's variables, that's data types. If you need more information on that, Python has a lot of documentation that you can go and check out. Okay, so now that we've talked about data types with variables, variable data types, I want to look at this interesting situation here. So you have a string, but it's 100. Now let's say you set this number 1 to 100. But later on you want to use that 100 in math. So that's going to cause a problem, because Python is going to see this as a string, and if it tries to do like a mathematic operation on a string, there's going to be an error there. So that's where casting comes in, and this is the second thing I wanted to introduce you guys to, is casting. So with this, if we were to set number 1 equal to a string of 100, but we wanted to use that 100 as a number, as an integer, what we could do is say number 1 equals int number 1. So what this is doing is it's actually converting the value of number 1, which is a string of 100. It's seeing if it's a number, and then it's converting that into an integer value. So it's just kind of converting from one data type to another data type. That's what casting is for. It allows you to convert data types. So you can convert a string to an integer, a string to a float to an int to a float. You can do all types of things like that. And the syntax is pretty simple. It's just whatever data type you want to convert to, open parenthesis, whatever you're wanting to actually convert, and then close parentheses. So this converts our string of 100 into an integer of 100. And now if we were to call, number 1, its value is actually equal to 100 integer 100, not string 100. So that's a little bit confusing. I know it is confusing at first. It's hard to grasp, but just be aware that there's data types int, float, and string, and your variables can be of those types, and you can convert between those types later on in your program. That's data types and variables. I think we've covered those pretty extensively. Now let's move on to input and output. So input is very simple. Python actually has a built-in command called input. And this, I'm going to just give you an example of what this command would kind of look like. So let's say in our algorithm we have input a new number. So what you can say in Python is input, and then you're going to write a prompt for the user to see. So input a new number, something like that. And then right after that, the user is going to enter a number and hit enter. And then it can be saved to a variable. So we could say number 1 equals input a new number. And then when they enter that number and hit enter, it'll get saved into this number 1. Now what we have to be aware of is the input takes everything as strings. So if we do want a number, we're going to have to cast that string to an integer, and that's what we just checked out in the last problem. So input, again, it's a way for you to get input from a keyboard from a user and use what they input in your program, in your execution of the program. So if we have a variable and we have this input command, whatever they enter after they see this prompt will be saved to that variable. Output is also very simple in Python, very straightforward. All you have to do with output is use a command called print. And literally print. That command there is going to just print that hello onto the console, and you're going to see this in a little bit, but it'll print that hello onto the console and you'll be able to see it. So input and output is a very important aspect of programming because it's used a lot, whether it's an actual user typing stuff in, or whether you're pulling from an API or a database or something like that, whether you're outputting to the console or outputting to a graphical interface. Input and output is extremely important, and it's used in pretty much every program. So this is how Python handles input and output. And again, Input, you're inputting data into the program to be used in the program. Output, you're sending data from your program execution out of the program for either the user to see or for a user interface to use, or whatever the case may be. You're sending it out after you're done with it. And that's how Python handles it in simple terms: print and input. So now that we have these concepts taken care of, let's actually get coding. So first and foremost, you're gonna have to set up Python on your computer, and you can just head over to python.org, go to downloads and download that. It should download everything you need. I'm not gonna go through this whole setup, but if you need more help, there's plenty of videos on YouTube, there's plenty of documentation to help you out there. Once you have it downloaded, if you type idle into your search bar down here, we're gonna open up this Python idle, and this is the main tool that we're gonna wanna use, at first at least. You can use other programs such as, Atom, Visual Studio Code. There's plenty of text editors out there that you can use, but at first we're just going to use this idle because it's very simple, and it's Python's own tool, so it's nice to kind of play around with. In this idle, you can actually do, basic stuff. Like if I were to say print hello like we had before, it's going to print that out, and it's kind of like a playground where you can test code, you can write code, just see what happens and mess around with it. It's a really nice tool. But what you can also do is make a file, and that's what we're going to do here. So go to File, New File. So once this file is open, we actually have an area to write our program, and then we can run this over here, which is pretty cool. So we can type code here, have it run over on the left side, which is awesome. So in this video, I want to type up this algorithm here, which is a little bit changed from episode 1, but it's still pretty much the same. I just changed these first 2 lines to kind of break them apart and make them more clear for you guys. So here we go. Here's our first problem. Here's our first actual coding situation. Now we know data types. We know how to assign a variable to a value. We know how to get input. We know how to get output. And we know how to cast variables to a different type now. So, honestly, if you guys want to try this on your own right now, don't be afraid, because I think I've given you the tools you need to actually write this whole thing. It's really not bad. You follow this step by step, you use the input command for these two, you're gonna, do a little bit of addition here, and then you're gonna output it here. The struggle is going to be figuring out where and when to do that casting. So if you want to try it out, pause the video, go for it. Good luck. I hope you get it done. So if you did that, if you were successful, awesome. You're on the road to being a good programmer already. I mean, that's not easy to do at first. So we're actually going to hop in and figure out how to do this if you struggled with it. So I'm going to show you my solution to this. Now, keep in mind, with programming, there's endless amounts of solutions to problems. You can do this in endless amount of ways. This is just one way. So we're going to start out with this first step here. And as you can see, user inputs number 1. So this is going to be an input command. And then we want to set a variable called number 1 equal to what they input. So that's pretty simple. Let's just start out with number 1 equals, and this is exactly like the input example I showed you guys right here. So number 1 equals input, and as you can see, Python is going to highlight in purple since it's a built-in function to Python. Then we want to write our prompt, and you can also see that Python pops up and gives you hints for what it's expecting, I guess. So right here, it's expecting a prompt. So enter number 1, and we'll give it a space and the quotes, and that will end our command here. So that's easy, that's simple, right? And now we're gonna do the same exact thing for number 2. So number 2 equals inputs, and again, it's gonna be purple. We gotta write our prompt, enter number 2. Done. Okay, so this is looking really, really good. Now, what I wanna do is actually run this in idle so you guys can see what is actually happening. So if we go to run module, you have to save it first. Okay, so once you find a place to save it, just name it whatever you want. I'm gonna name it sum, and we can save it. And then, as you can see, over on the left side, it gets ran. And so here's our prompt that we wrote, and now it's expecting input. So if we said 10, hit enter, then that 10 is going to be saved to this number 1 variable. Pretty cool, right? I think it's pretty cool. And now it's asking for number 2, which is right here. And if we were to enter 5, it's going to finish because that's all we have. But now at this point, number 1 and number 2 have the values of 10 and 5 stored inside of them, which is pretty freaking cool. And now later on, we can call these numbers, which we're about to do, and use those values associated with them to get our sum. So let's move back to our algorithm, and we want to make sum. Now, the problem is with sum is it's a keyword in Python already, so we can't actually use that to name a variable. So I'm just going to call this answer, and that is going to equal number 1 plus number 2. Okay. And then finally, we have this output, and I taught you guys output. It's just that simple print command. Now, when I showed you print, I did something like print hello, but what you can also do is actually just print out a variable, and what it's going to do is print the value associated with that variable. It knows automatically how to do that. It's not going to print the actual word answer, it's going to print the value associated with answer. So whatever we assign to answer right here is what will be print out. So let's see if this works. Enter number 1, 10. Enter number 2, 5. Ooh, well, what the hell is that? That's not what we want. 105, that's not 10 plus 5, it should be 15. So recall, what data type is returned from an input? So what is this number 1? Is it an integer? Is it a float? Is it a string? Well, with input, it's going to be a string. So whatever gets sent back by the user is going to be read in as a string, and number 1 is then going to be a string. Same goes for number 2. So what this line right here is actually doing is adding 2 strings together, which we're going to cover in the next video when we go over operators. It's adding 2 strings together. So it's kind of just smushing the 2 together. As you can see, 10 and 5, it just smushes them together to make 105. It's not actually adding the integer values. So, remember we have casting. Now we're going to use casting in this line here. So if we were to go int number 1, int number 2, what is this actually doing? Well, it's converting number 1, which is a string due to the input command. It's converting that to an integer, and it's converting number 2 to an integer, and then it's doing actually mathematical addition to those 2 integers rather than just combining the strings. So it's actually going to add the values that we passed in. So that's kind of the difference between a string and an integer. When you do addition, when you do mathematical operations on a string, it's not going to work in the way you're expecting it to. So even if you had a string that is 100 or a string that is 10 and 5, it's not going to work because it is a string. To do mathematical operations, it needs to be an integer or a float. So just keep that in mind. And now when we run this, if we are to do 10 and 5, we get 15 because it converts these to integers. It actually adds them like we would think addition would do, and then it prints that answer out for you. So there it is, guys. There is episode 2. We covered input, we covered output, we covered data types, we covered casting, we covered a lot of stuff in this video. So in the future, if you're having trouble, be sure to come back and check this video out. I know it was long, I know it was long-winded, but for beginner programmers, I really wanted to get in depth and show you what this is all about. In episode 3, we will be covering more new concepts. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to be covering, but I do want to expand on this program and make it better. And I'll show you how in future episodes, but we're going to make it better with other tools that Python gives us, and we're going to be covering those soon. So there it is, guys. You wrote your first program. It's pretty cool. It can add 2 numbers together. It asks you for the 2 numbers, it adds them together, and it outputs it. Pretty cool, pretty sweet. We learned major core concepts. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in episode 3. Can't wait to keep this series going because I'm having a lot of fun with it. Peace, guys.